Lily stood in the courtroom, hands trembling as she handed the folder to the judge. Silence. Then, Judge Crawford's face darkened. Ron Doyle shot up, panic in his voice. "She's lying!" But Lily wasn't. She knew exactly what she had found, and when the truth came out, it shattered everything. But what happened next shocked even those who thought they'd seen everything. But let's start from the beginning. The courtroom was no longer silent. A ripple of tension spread through the crowd, whispers growing louder as the weight of Lily's words sank in. Judge Crawford tapped her gavel twice, restoring order. Ron Doyle, usually a man of perfect control, leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Lily, assessing, searching for an opening to dismantle her claims before they gained traction. Samuel Briggs, his attorney, straightened his tie and stood. "Objection, Your Honor. These are baseless accusations from a child." "Sit down, Mr. Briggs," Judge Crawford interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned her gaze back to Lily. "Miss Doyle, you said there were letters. Threatening letters. Can you elaborate?" Lily swallowed hard. Her hands gripped the wooden stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. I wasn't supposed to find them." Her voice trembled, but she pushed forward. "There was a storm that night. The power went out. I was looking for candles in my stepfather's office when I knocked over one of his bookshelves." She paused, her breath shallow, eyes flickering to Ron. His stare was cold now, not just calculating, dangerous. Behind the shelf was a hidden compartment, a safe. It was already slightly open, like someone had forgotten to close it properly. I knew I shouldn't, but I looked inside. The tension in the room was suffocating. Even the jury leaned in, drawn into the slow, deliberate unraveling of something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. "And what did you find?" the prosecutor asked, his voice steady but pressing. Lily's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Bank records, a list of offshore accounts, fake names linked to real transactions, millions of dollars." She let the words settle before continuing. "But the letters, those were worse." For the first time since the trial began, Meredith Doyle, Ron's wife, seemed to break out of her carefully maintained composure. "What letters?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily looked down for a brief moment, remembering the way her hands had shaken as she unfolded the brittle pages, their edges yellowed with time. "They were from my mother, and to my mother." Meredith gasped. Lily forced herself to continue. "The ones she wrote. They were desperate, pleading. She wanted to leave, but she was terrified. She kept saying she knew too much, that she had to get away, but she couldn't. Not without me." Her voice cracked. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "And the ones he wrote?" the prosecutor pressed. Lily lifted her chin, locking eyes with her stepfather. "They were threats." A heavy silence blanketed the room. "She wasn't supposed to run," Lily whispered. "He made that very clear." Ronald Doyle exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Pure fiction." The prosecutor ignored him. "Miss Doyle, do you have these letters?" Lily reached into her backpack, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of the documents she had hidden for weeks. The entire room watched as she pulled out a folder, holding it in both hands like it carried the weight of something inescapable. The bailiff stepped forward, taking the folder and walking it over to Judge Crawford. The judge took her time opening it, flipping through the pages with measured precision. As her eyes scanned the contents, her expression darkened. Ron shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. Briggs, his attorney, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, these documents need to be authenticated." Judge Crawford lifted a hand, silencing him without looking up. "We will verify them," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I can already tell you, these letters are very real." Lily could feel her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. Meredith was staring at her husband, her lips slightly parted, her breathing uneven. "Ron," she said, voice fragile, on the verge of breaking. "Tell me she's lying." He didn't answer. For the first time, Ron Doyle had no perfectly rehearsed response, no charming dismissal, no calculated deflection, just silence. And in that silence, the truth settled like a storm cloud, ready to break. The room turned electric. The murmurs that had only moments ago been whispers swelled into a wave of noise. Judge Crawford banged her gavel, her voice cutting through the tension. "Order! There will be order in my courtroom!" Slowly, the noise subsided, but the weight of Lily's words hung thick in the air. Ronald Doyle didn't sit. His hands were planted on the table in front of him, his knuckles white with pressure. His gaze was locked on Lily, but for the first time, his confidence faltered. Meredith sat frozen beside him. Her lips parted slightly, her breathing shallow. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the lingering tension in the room. Lily squared her shoulders, gripping the edge of the witness stand to keep herself steady. "She's alive," she repeated, her voice louder this time, stronger. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Miss Doyle, do you have proof of this?" Lily inhaled sharply. She had been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it settled heavily on her chest. "Not direct proof," she admitted. "Not yet, but I know she's out there." Ron let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, turning to Judge Crawford. "We're really letting this child stand up here and spin stories like this? She's grasping at straws." But his voice wasn't as steady as before. His composure, which had seemed unshakable just moments ago, was beginning to fracture. The prosecutor ignored him and leaned in slightly, his eyes locked onto Lily's. "Tell us why you believe your mother is alive." Lily licked her lips, trying to ignore the way her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "The letters," she said. "The ones I found in the safe. Some were written years ago, but there was one that was different. It wasn't old like the others. The paper wasn't yellowed. The ink hadn't faded." A ripple went through the courtroom. Even Judge Crawford seemed to lean in slightly. "How recent?" the prosecutor asked. Lily hesitated. "Less than a year ago." A collective gasp swept through the spectators. Ron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. "That doesn't prove anything," Briggs, his attorney, cut in quickly. "Even if what she's saying is true, there's no way to know for certain who wrote those letters." Lily's hands curled into fists. "I know my mother's handwriting," she shot back. "And this one, it wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't a confession. It was a plea. She was begging for help, and someone answered her." The tension in the room thickened. "Answered her?" Judge Crawford pressed. "What do you mean?" Lily's pulse roared in her ears. This was the moment she had dreaded the most, the part where her theory could either crumble or expose something far worse than she had ever imagined. She gripped the wooden stand. There was a second note, a response, and it wasn't signed by my mother. A few jurors exchanged nervous glances. The prosecutor was the only one who remained unreadable, though his gaze never wavered from Lily. "Who wrote it?" Lily's throat tightened. Her fingers dug into the polished surface of the stand. "I don't know," she admitted. "It wasn't signed with a name, just initials." Briggs latched on to that immediately. "Then this means nothing," he said smoothly, adjusting his glasses. "It could have been written by anyone." Lily clenched her teeth. "Not just anyone," she countered. The message was short, but it was clear. She glanced at the judge, then at the prosecutor. It said, "We have her." A collective shudder passed through the courtroom. Briggs's smug expression faltered. Meredith let out a choked breath, her hands covering her mouth. Ron was stiff, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were sharp, focused, calculating. "And you think that means your mother is still alive?" the prosecutor asked carefully. Lily nodded. Whoever wrote that note, they weren't talking about someone who was already dead. They were talking about someone they were holding, someone they still had. The weight of her words pressed down on the room like a lead blanket. Judge Crawford finally spoke, her voice measured. "Miss Doyle, did you bring these notes with you today?" Lily reached into her backpack again, retrieving another folded document. The bailiff stepped forward, taking it and handing it to the judge. Judge Crawford unfolded the pages carefully, her expression unreadable as she scanned the contents. Then, ever so slightly, her brows furrowed. Briggs shifted. "Your Honor, I strongly urge the court to consider—" "Mr. Briggs," Judge Crawford said, her tone clipped. "Your client has some explaining to do." The attorney hesitated. Ron finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "This is a farce," he said flatly. "No one has my wife. She left of her own free will. This girl is delusional." Lily didn't blink. "Then why are you shaking?" The words were quiet, but they struck like a hammer. The entire courtroom turned to Ron. His hands were on the table, fingers digging into the polished wood. His jaw was clenched tight, his nostrils flaring ever so slightly, and he was shaking. Just a little, but enough. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I request immediate action to verify the legitimacy of these letters and launch an investigation into their origins." Judge Crawford nodded slowly. "Agreed." The gavel came down. The noise in the courtroom erupted. Reporters were already writing, whispering, shifting excitedly in their seats. The jury exchanged looks, some leaning in to murmur to each other. Meredith was staring at Ron like she had never seen him before. Lily? Lily was staring at the man who had controlled her life for years. And for the first time she saw it. Not the businessman, not the philanthropist. She saw fear. The courtroom was a battlefield. Chaos rippled through the room, voices overlapping in waves of shock and outrage. The revelation had detonated like an explosive, shaking the foundation of everything Ronald Doyle had built. Judge Crawford pounded her gavel. "Enough! There will be order!" The noise simmered down, but tension still pulsed in the air like an electric charge. Lily sat frozen at the witness stand, her breath shallow. She had expected this moment, had prepared for it, but nothing could have braced her for the raw force of seeing her stepfather's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Investigators had taken the letters, the documents, the hidden records, everything. And when they returned, they didn't come back empty-handed. The evidence was damning. The handwriting analysis confirmed it. Margaret Doyle had written those desperate letters. The financial records told their own story. Shell corporations, fraudulent transactions, and offshore accounts all linked back to Ron Doyle. But it wasn't the money that had stunned the courtroom into silence. It was her. The moment the officer stepped forward, his voice steady but heavy with significance, time seemed to slow. "Your Honor, we found her. Margaret Doyle is alive." The reaction was instant. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as reporters scribbled furiously, their pens barely keeping up with the moment. The jury exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the bailiff, who had stood motionless for most of the trial, flinched at the weight of the words. Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. She had hoped, prayed, but to hear it out loud? Her mother was alive. Ron Doyle's composure finally cracked, and what was left beneath it was nothing but unfiltered rage. "You ungrateful little brat!" he snarled, his voice low and venomous. The room sucked in a collective breath. For years he had worn the mask of a respected businessman, a loving stepfather, a grieving widower. But in that moment, with his carefully woven lies unraveling around him, the real Ron Doyle finally emerged. Briggs, his attorney, lunged forward, hissing under his breath, "Ron, sit down, now." But it was too late. The damage was done. The jury had seen it. The judge had seen it. Everyone had seen it. The prosecutor, standing tall with newfound momentum, addressed the bench with unshakable authority. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence, we request immediate revocation of Mr. Doyle's custodial rights and a full-scale federal investigation into his finances, as well as his involvement in his wife's disappearance." Meredith Doyle had been silent, paralyzed by the storm unfolding before her. But now, as if waking from a trance, she slowly turned to face her husband, the man she had defended, trusted, believed in. Her lips trembled as she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "I had no idea." Ron let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, cut the act, Meredith," he spat. "You played along just fine until now." Meredith took a shaky step back. For the first time in all the years she had been at his side, she looked afraid of him. And Ron saw it. His patience, his control, whatever was left of it, snapped like a frayed wire. His fist slammed down on the table with a crack that sent shockwaves through the room. "You think you've won, Lily?" His voice was low, dangerous. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on her like a predator sizing up its prey. "You don't know what you've done." Lily didn't flinch. Not this time. She had spent years shrinking in his presence, suffocated by his authority, his power, his influence. But today, she wasn't afraid. She lifted her chin, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I've done what my mother was too afraid to do," she said, her voice unwavering. "I stood up to you." Ron Doyle had spent years controlling everyone around him, but for the first time in his life, he had lost. The trial extended for weeks, but the evidence was undeniable. With Lily's testimony, financial records, and her mother's return, Ronald Doyle's empire crumbled. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Verdict: guilty. The courtroom was filled with gasps and muffled cheers. Judge Crawford nodded. "Mr. Doyle, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." Ron stared at Lily as he was escorted out in handcuffs. "You ruined me," he spat. Lily, standing strong, met his gaze. "No, you ruined yourself." Her mother, weak but alive, hugged her tightly. Meredith, pale and shaken, turned to Lily. "I never saw the real him, but you did." Lily exhaled, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, justice had been served, and she had been the one to make it happen.